Well, hi, Church. Pastor Allen here, and it's my privilege to bring you our Friday devotional this week. And what I thought I'd do is I thought I'd actually do something a bit different. As you get to know me, you'll find out that I'm a bit of an outside the box thinker. And so, what I thought is for today, let's take our focus off of the virus and all the other things that are going on and instead dive into what is by far one of my favorite topics, and that is how we see Christ in all of the Old Testament. And that is, all of the Old Testament points to the person and work of Jesus Christ. He not only fulfills prophecies, but he fulfills all the little details of the Old Testament, and he is the true and greater of everything that is foreshadowed in the Old Testament. So specifically for this weekend, I would draw your attention to Numbers chapter 11. In Numbers chapter 11, there's two stories that occur in verses 1 through 30. And each of those stories has kind of a climax which points to something that Jesus will do. In verses 1 through 15, there's the story of Moses and the people complaining against God, really through Moses. So they're complaining to Moses, but they're complaining against God. And God has done so much to provide for Israel. He's brought them out of Egypt. He's released them from slavery. He's got them on the edge of the promised land. At this point in the story, he's even provided manna, this bread from heaven. But their complaining is almost too much for Moses to bear. And he cries out to God in verse 14, saying, I am not able to carry all this people alone. The burden is too heavy for me. Again, he says in verse 14, Numbers 11, I am not able to carry all this people alone. The burden is too heavy for me. The burden for Moses is too much to bear. And I want you to just keep that in mind, that the burden of all the people is too much for Moses to bear. And then if you read on, verses 16 through 30, that story is about Moses appointing elders, in part to relieve him of this burden. But it also goes on to say that there's two men in verse 26 who are prophesying and doing works of the Spirit there in the camp of Israel. And Aaron and Miriam, they get upset about this, and they say, only Moses is God's authorized spokesperson. But Moses' response is great. In verse 29, he says, would that all the Lord's people were prophets, that the Lord would put his Spirit on them. And so two quick stories culminate in one, Moses recognizing he is not able to bear the burdens of the people of Israel. And two, it would be great if there were ever a day where God's Spirit would be poured out on all people, and all people would become like Moses, these people who can do God's work within humanity. And then we come to find out, of course, in the New Testament, Jesus is the true and better Moses. He bears the burdens of our sins when he goes to the cross. Isaiah 53, speaking of Jesus, says in verse 4, surely he, that is Christ, has borne our grief and carried our sorrows. And so we see that Jesus is the true and better Moses who bears all the burdens of the people, namely the burdens of our sin, when he takes those to the cross. But secondly, we then see that Jesus, because of his life, death, and resurrection, then pours out his Spirit on all his people. And so Moses really longed for our day. And our day is the day which Jesus speaks about in John 3:34, saying that is the day where God gives the Spirit without limit. And it's just a quick illustration from the Old Testament of how Christ is the true and greater and fulfills so many things from the Old Testament. This type of study, it can be called typology or Christocentric study, and it's really just fascinating ways to read through the Old Testament and see how much it speaks to the person and work of Christ. So maybe take that this weekend, dive into Numbers 11, and really you could look throughout all of the Old Testament, and you'll see over and over again how it points to Christ. But in Numbers 11 specifically, Jesus is the true and greater Moses who bears the burdens of all our sins. And then Jesus is the true and greater Moses who pours his Spirit out on all people so that all people can minister in his name. I think that's something that we've already really seen in the last couple of weeks. Many of us bearing burdens far beyond maybe what we thought we could bear or even thought we would ever have to bear. But we find that we're able to bear those burdens, but more so, Christ bore the burdens for our sins. And then it's been just incredible to see and hear the stories of church members reaching out to each other. And I would highly encourage you to do that again this weekend. Reach out to other members in the church, your friends, your family, and your neighbors, because unlike Moses' day, we live in a day in the new covenant where we all have God's Spirit and we are all His ministers to this broken and dying world. God bless you, church. I hope you have a great weekend. Look forward to interacting with you on Sunday. Don't forget to submit prayer requests or questions or anything like that, and we'll look forward to interacting in some way on Sunday. God bless.